Today we celebrate the feast day of St. Mark the Evangelist, and one of the shortest Gospels, but also the very first Gospel. And how wonderful that the Church gives us this beautiful Gospel to celebrate St. Mark's feast day. I wonder how many times you and I have actually sat and maybe in reflection or in meditation thought, these very things that we hear in the gospel story today are the very reason why you and I can sit here today and celebrate the Eucharist. What these men did, and those that accompanied them, as I'm pretty sure there were many women that accompanied them along the way, it was their testimony, it was their faith, it was their commissioning to move forward that actually has allowed what you and I celebrate today. That's what the Church is. That's what the Church has always been. And I think one of the most important things that we hear in the gospel story today, go into the whole world and proclaim the gospel to every creature. Those words resonated in me because when we were in the minor seminary at St. John Vianney down in Westchester, those were the words inscribed in that very beautiful mural painted by Gabriel Lois. And every single day, sometimes 2 and 3 times a day when we entered that chapel, those were the words that looked down upon us. Go into the whole world and proclaim the gospel to every creature. What powerful things. Because if you and I have the faith that we have today, it is precisely because these men went into the world and preached the gospel. The first reading we have today, listening to what happens to St. Stephen, even in his death, as the Church calls the martyrs the seed of death, the seed of faith through their death, preaching by his own life who he was and who he believed. And it's interesting because what we hear at the end of the gospel is not that these men are still looking up as Jesus is ascended. This is the last verse of the Gospel of Mark. They're not looking up to heaven. Mark records and says they went forth and preached everywhere. So maybe the question then becomes, what do I do to preach? Do I have a little book? Do I have to wear a suit and tie? Should I get a little box so that I can be elevated so people can see me? And maybe go out into supermarkets and start telling people that God is coming and they're going to burn in hell if they don't believe in God. No, I don't really think you're going to get a lot of followers that way, I can promise you. You're going to find a lot of people avoiding you. What these people did, and what you and I are called to do as we preach the gospel, is tell people your story. Tell people the testimony of your life. Father, my life isn't a very pretty one. Good. Because if you're here today, it means that God can take all of that we might think is very unpretty and use it. Lest we forget St. Paul and what he did in today's first reading and who Paul becomes. My brothers and sisters, God uses absolutely everything that is at our disposal, and oftentimes the very things that we believe God is unable to use. Our purpose, our call, our commissioning is to go and preach. We don't have to be theologians. We don't need to know every dogma of the Church. We don't have to memorize the catechism of the Church. If you do, great. But what people are looking for is, how has God touched you? Who is this God that you believe in? Who is this God that you get up every single day and you fight traffic on Johnson and on the car line to make it on time to Mass? Because it must be one heck of a God to be in that car line every single morning and still make it on time. You see, that's what happens in our hearts. We're preaching without maybe even opening our mouths. We're preaching by the way we live our lives. These men were able to preach the gospel, and because of what they did, you and I get to sit here today and celebrate the Eucharist. Imagine that. Imagine what God is capable of doing through your life as you're commissioned of going forth and preaching everywhere. Amen.